Good evening, everybody. My name is Simon Jackman. I'm Professor of Political Science and the CEO of the United States Study Centre out at the University of Sydney, and I see many familiar faces who know exactly who I am. So welcome back to another United States Study Centre event. Thank you for coming. Before we go any further, I'd like to acknowledge that this part of the University of Sydney, like the main part of the University of Sydney, stands on the traditional lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. Tonight, intriguing topic we're going to take a look at, and we're pleased to have a special visitor from North America. Not the United States, as well as I'll say in just a moment, but it's Peter Loewen is our guest tonight. Peter's Canadian and is a professor of political science at the University of Toronto. And he's currently hanging out at my old stomping ground, Stanford. He's on a 12-month. The rest of North America thinks of those fellowships as bliss. Those of us, we called it home, but you're welcome. But at Stanford's Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences, a research retreat, essentially, an institute that sits up on the hill behind Stanford, where a few fortunate souls get to spend a year in solitude, thinking great thoughts and doing great research. That Peter's going to share some of that with us tonight. Peter's topic is the fear of automation and its connection to the rise of populism and protectionism in recent democratic politics. Now, of course, for a United States Study Centre, this is firmly and squarely in our frame of reference. There are many, many stories told about public opinion in the United States, particularly around the 2016 election. What is the source of support for a candidate like Donald Trump? It goes by many names, economic anxiety being one of them. Other people think it's a lot more simple than that, good old-fashioned racial prejudice, for instance. But what's been kind of conspicuously lacking from a lot of this speculation about the sources of support for a populist candidate, or certainly a very unorthodox candidate like a Trump, and for that matter for other populist candidates around the democratic world, what's been lacking is an unpacking of the disparate sources, the drivers of what is making people turn to the unconventional candidates. One story is that it is a fear of technology and being displaced in the workplace, and that gels with a lot of stories that we tell about Trump. White men, older men, lower status in all sorts of realms. Culturally, to be sure, but most predominantly in the workplace, in the labour market. To what extent is that actually true? And Peter actually has some data to share with us tonight. That's, as I gather, hot off the press. And not only that, Peter is hot off the plane, I understand as well, right?
I got here today.
You got in this morning, yeah, I know. So thank you for making the big effort. Peter's an exceptionally well-travelled person, so not his first time to Australia, and so he's familiar with just powering through the jet lag. So what's going to happen? Peter has prepared a presentation. Don't say that. Peter has prepared a presentation. Yeah. That will go for about 20 minutes, and then what I'd like to do is to have a little bit of back and forth, myself and the director of our Innovation and Entrepreneurship program, sort of heading up the part of the United States Study Centre that where we focus on these sorts of issues, and that's Claire McFarland. We'll be joining Peter and myself up here for a little bit of Q&A before we open it up to everybody to react to what Peter's got to share with us tonight. Peter, welcome back to Sydney. This is all set up and ready to go for you. Have at it. And I will sit somewhere where I can watch the presentation. But it's all you. Thank you.
Simon. Well, it's very nice to be here, and I appreciate the invitation very much. And what I want to do this evening is talk a little bit about the relationship, if there is one, between automation, people's fear of automation, and populism. And this is a nice little opening slide. The person on the bottom, of course, is Donald Trump in all of his glory, and at the top is a cabless, driverless transport. which if you haven't seen, you'll see more of on the roads over the next 10 years. So let's just think about two big trends that are going on in the world right now to kind of frame this talk. One trend is that economies are being revolutionized by artificial intelligence and by automation. And I'll talk a little bit about what that looks like in a second. But I'll just say that there are three things, I think, which are well worth noting about automation and artificial intelligence and its effect on the economy. One is that the speed at which this is changing the economy is not well known, which is to say that whatever forecast someone gives you today about how quickly automation is going to occur in some industry or not occur in another industry is probably wrong, could be wildly wrong. The averages are probably right, but where that'll happen, I think, is very hard to anticipate. The relationship is that the implication of that is that the areas or kind of the sectoral places where automation is going to take hold is hard to predict as well, and I'll show you kind of why that is in a second when you think about this in a multidimensional way. But it's easy to say, probably with a lot of accuracy, that automation is going to revolutionize some industries. It's hard to say which ones it's going to revolutionize or what kind of tasks it's going to revolutionize. And the third is that governments are not even close to cracking the nut about how to deal with automation, how to respond to it. So if you follow city politics, really in any kind of big metropolis around the world, you'll see that policymakers tie themselves in knots trying to figure out how to regulate Uber. And that's a pretty simple problem. Right? We've been regulating taxis forever. A technology comes along, it brings in more drivers, but it's not that hard to kind of figure out what's going on here. People are driving cars and taking people to more places, and there's more of those people in the market now, and you can think about what the implications of it are. When you start wondering what happens when, for example, law firms rely on the automated reading of texts to make decisions about whether a contract is good or not, right? Or if you think about what happens when hospitals rely on algorithms to determine who should be operated on or not, and doctors are completely deferential to algorithms, then you realize that there are more complicated problems. Okay? So governments aren't really anywhere close to knowing what to do with a lot of forms of automation. There's another trend that's going on, which is that there's some mix of populism and nativism, and it's returning to our politics. And every time you think it's kind of reached its crest, one of two things happens. Either within some country it gets worse, so you open up the New York Times every day and something else has been said by the President of the United States, or you think there's some country which surely must be immune to the populist virus, and it gets caught by it. So it gets deeper in the places where it's present, and it's spreading at the same time. I'll talk a little bit more about these populists in a second, but there's three things I'll say about them right now. Is that they learn from each other. They look around the world and see what other people are doing. The second is that they're very good at exploiting uncertainty and people's fretfulness over the future. And the third is that they're actually not very good at policy, which matters a lot for their long-term success. Now the question isn't, are these trends happening? They certainly are. The really relevant question to me is, how are they related to one another? So what I want to do is talk a little bit about automation very quickly, talk about populism very quickly, and then show you what the relationship is between people who fear automation and what their views on politics are, and what it is they want from political leaders. So here quickly are some tables that one of my friends at McKinsey sent to me. So this is McKinsey slides always have a lot of information on them, and you're just meant to go through them quickly and appear very, very big picture as you're doing it. The story on this slide is that automation and artificial intelligence are a lot of different things. Okay, it's not only putting a robot into a factory, it's using machines to read data and read large amounts of text. It's about making predictions. It's about developing natural language tools that allow us to read and process massive amounts of written and verbal data all at once. It's about increasing the intelligence of workflows. There's all sorts of things that are going on. It's not just robots making widgets better than humans. If you want to know why it's hard to predict where automation is going, this graph will give you a sense of it. So you can see here along the bottom is how much people are being paid. So as you go farther left, you see people are getting paid more. And as you go up the graph, it tells you how much of a person's job can be automated. So look at the landscaping and groundskeeping workers way down there in the bottom. Not paid very much, right? But very hard to automate landscaping and groundskeeping. A file clerk, not paid much, very easy to automate, right? Turns out for a CEO, though, that a fair amount of what they do every day can be automated. A quarter of it. So who do you automate in this case? Right? It's not clear where your value is. So it's hard to know with any technology exactly who it's going to impact and how it's going to impact people. That means that it's very hard for people to know whether they're going to be negatively affected by automation and by artificial intelligence. And this is just showing you that it's not just simple jobs. People who work in auditing, people who work in taxation, people who work in business development, revenue management have massive parts of their jobs which are open to automation. So if automation is going to revolutionize the economy, it's not going to be for people in a single sector or in a single income class. It's going to be across the board. It's a big change. I'll say something about populists very quickly. The fellow up in the upper left-hand corner is Viktor Orbán. If you know him, he's the Prime Minister of Hungary. And there's three things that are worth noting about Orbán as an example of a populist. One is that he's a great political entrepreneur. He started out as a liberal, failed at that, returned as a populist. He found something that worked. It's the first thing that's worth noting. Second thing that's worth noting is that he is driven by, and his appeal is driven by nativism and by immigration. The biggest challenge in Hungary is not the inward migration of people from other countries, it's the outward migration of native Hungarians to other countries. The idea that populism is, in its response to migration, is all about people coming into countries misses that it's a very nuanced thing, actually. It's got various causes that differ from country to country. All of them are underwritten, though, by a sense of uncertainty, by a sense of the core people of the country being sold out by other people somewhere. But it's not just, or even principally, about pressures of in-migration in every country where there's populists. The third thing I'll note about him is that he's not very good at policy, actually. Right? He's actually not a very good public policy entrepreneur, implementer of policies. He doesn't have a lot of solutions to actually solve Hungary's problems. He spends a lot of time picking fights with things like the Central European University. This is a story about a lot of populists, right? They're right about the problems and wrong about the solutions. But he's one of a type around the world, and they're on the ascendant. And this nice graph from The Economist just shows over time the varying fortunes, but the secularly increasing fortunes of populists across the Western world. So here's the question. What's the relationship between these three things? Between people who hold populist and nativist views, and I'll tell you what those are in particular in a second. Between people who fear automation and their political preferences. And are they all related to one another? Okay. And I'm going to show you in a second that they're not necessarily related to one another in the ways that we think they might be. So here are the questions. Do populists and nativists fear automation more than people who aren't populists and nativists? Now thinking about citizens, not about politicians. What are the policy preferences of populists and nativists? And what are the policy preferences of those who fear automation? And what are the political preferences of them? So moving aside from policy onto politics, what are their preferences? And what I'm going to show you is this, is that it is the case that we know this, that people have populist and nativist views have certain political preferences. They prefer parties of the right for the most part, of a certain type. And I'm going to show you that there's a relationship between people who are populist and who have nativist preferences and a fear of automation. If you fear automation more, you're more likely to hold populist and nativist preferences. But there's not yet a clear link, at least in the data we have in Australia and in the United States, between people who fear automation and their political preferences. The link's yet to be made. It's going to be made by political entrepreneurs who are going to come along and say, you fear automation, here is the policy response to that. You fear automation, you ought to fear it, and here is what a government ought to do in response. And I'm going to show you that, in fact, the responses that are available to governments in some ways cross the political spectrum. So it remains an open question as to which policy entrepreneurs can really grab this by the nettle and say that they're the ones who have a solution for automation. Before that, I want to show you what it actually looks like in terms of people's fears of automation and how it relates to their nativism and their populism. So the data for this are coming from the US and Canada. We just ran 2 studies, 500 people per country. It's conducted online. It's representative of the population if you weighed it out. Won't talk about this too much, but it's only to say that the data reflect the way the population feels at its core. I'm going to measure a couple of things. One is populism. And populism here doesn't describe, as I talk about it, nativist views. Populism is something different. It's an anti-politics, an anti-system sentiment. It can be captured by those on the left, think Jeremy Corbyn, or those on the right, think Donald Trump. It takes different forms in different places, right? And it's distinct from nativism. I'll show you how we measure that in a second. We use questions like this. Do people agree or disagree with statements like, the American economy is rigged to advantage the rich and powerful? To fix the United States, we need a strong leader willing to break the rules. The U.S. needs a strong leader to take the country back from the rich and powerful. You get a sense when you look at those questions what we're talking about when we talk about populism. And you should get a sense that a political entrepreneur can come from the left or the right and offer themselves as an answer to those types of sentiments. Nativism is something different. It describes a preference for existing members of a society against outsiders. You can combine it with populism to generate right-wing populism. It's almost definitionally what right-wing populism is. But nativism is itself something that's distinct from populism. It runs together in political rhetoric, but they're two separate ideas. This is how we would measure whether people have nativist views. You ask them if they agree or disagree with questions like this. Immigrants take jobs away from real Americans. The U.S. would be stronger if we stopped immigration. When jobs are scarce, employers should prioritize hiring people of this country over immigrants. You get a sense now that we're not talking about the same thing between populism and nativism, but that they go together in political rhetoric. Okay, let's talk about the data. If we ask people, how many of your friends and family's jobs do you think will be replaced by a computer or machine within the next 5 years? This is what the distribution looks like. So most people are actually not, the majority is not convinced that automation is going to replace most jobs, and they're probably right about that over a 5-year period, right? 35% say no jobs will be lost to automation, 44% say a few. Now, I wouldn't make a stock market bet on what citizens tell you in response to an online survey about where automation is going, but this gives you a sense of what their sentiments are. You've only got 12 plus 9, so 21%, 22% who think many or most jobs will be taken away. Now, if you look at it over 10 years on the right, you see that people shift. People understand that more jobs are going to be gone to automation as time goes on. And if you ask them over 25 years, you see now the majority of people are saying that many or most jobs will be lost. That's not super surprising, right? But if you break it down by those people who don't hold populist views on the left and those who do hold populist views on the right, then you start to see the big differences. Right? Among those who hold populist views, 52% think many or most jobs of the people they know will be lost to automation within 10 years. For non-populists, it's only 34%. It's the same thing if you break people up by whether they're nativist or non-nativist. Those on the left who don't hold nativist sentiments about immigration, 35% of them think that most jobs will be lost to automation over 10 years, many or most. Among nativists, it's a majority, 53%. This is in the US, by the way. We can talk about the Australian data in a little while. If you ask people how afraid you are of robots replacing people in the workforce, it's kind of a crude way of getting at automation, but it gets at the way people think about it. You've got 25%, 15 are afraid, 10% are very afraid. Okay? A majority, in fact, 3/4 tell us that they're not afraid or only slightly afraid. I don't know what slightly afraid means, but they're slightly afraid. But if you look at populists and compare them to non-populists, you start to see the differences, right? 19 plus 15, 34% of populists are afraid or very afraid of robots replacing people in the workforce. It's 20% of people who are non-populists. Nativists, it's the same story. Those people who fear immigration, who think that the country ought to close its borders to those from outside the country, are also those who are afraid that that robots are going to take the jobs of people that they know. Now, what are they? Those are the fears in some sense, right? I mean, this is where they're at in terms of their sentiments. What do they want government to do? So we asked folks whether they agreed or disagreed with the following statement: the government should penalize companies for firing workers and replacing them with computers or machines. Let's get away from the policy particulars of how a government would actually punish corporations for doing this, but ask people if they agree. Among those who are non-populists, 9% strongly agree. 26% agree, so a third. Among those who are populists, a majority agree or slightly agree. Think about that for a second, right? A corporation wants to come along, and rather than having a person take something from a shelf and put it into, put it on a belt, as it's being manufactured, a pretty simple task which a robot can do easily, a majority of people think government should punish a corporation for doing that. If we ask them, do you think consumers should boycott corporations that automate, the same numbers appear. If we ask them, do you think the corporation should abstain from automating altogether? Similar numbers appear. It's the same if you look at nativists, by the way. The majority of them, nearly 2/3, agree or strongly agree that the government should punish corporations who automate. If you're a political entrepreneur, think about what your response is to that, right? How it is that you start to speak to people who have those fears and those beliefs. So as I said, similar breakdowns occur if we ask consumers ask people if consumers should boycott companies and if corporations should voluntarily avoid automation. The final thing I'll say is that there's no relationship between a fear of automation and people's trade preferences. There's no linear relationship between it. Partially this is because the views on trade have been upended in the United States, as Donald Trump's railed against trade for a long time, and it kind of has upset the way people think about trade, but it's not yet linked into protectionism. Finally, we asked people questions in the US that were like this. We sort of said, we're going to give you two statements, and we want you to tell us which one you agree with more. What we're trying to get at here is whether people support government taking any kind of action against automation. So they would receive a pairing of statements that look like the ones at the bottom. Automation and AI are going to take away a large number of jobs, so the federal government should begin decreasing immigration of skilled workers from other countries. Or do you think that there's nothing the national government can do and workers should just prepare themselves? So that pairing either had the policy solution of reducing skilled immigration, or reducing unskilled immigration, or investing in science and technology, or retraining workers. So what we're trying to get at here is which policy actions people think are reasonable responses. Here's the interesting thing. If you look at that first column, which is a bit hard to see, if you can see it from the back, you should sign up as a sniper with the government. But the story is that among people who are not nativists and not populists, most of them don't actually want government to take action, policy action to deal with automation. Among those who are nativists or populists, more always want government to take action, kind of regardless of what the action is, whether it's reducing immigration, or it's investing in STEM, or it's investing in retraining of adults. If you look at those who fear automation versus those who don't, which is the last two columns of the table, then it becomes a really stark difference, right? Those who fear automation have a big appetite for government to do something. And it's not just reducing immigration. They're supportive of governments that'll invest in science and technology education and mathematics. They're supportive of governments that'll invest in retraining. Finally, here's what vote choice looks like in the United States. The story here is that a fear of automation is not yet linked into vote choice. So the Republican split among nativists and populists is 58 versus 45 for those who are non-nativists and populists. The Republican Party has a 13-point boost among nativists and populists versus those who aren't. But if you look at those who fear automation versus those who don't fear automation, it's just 6 points, 56 versus 50. Okay. There's clearly a link between people's fear of automation and whether they're populists and nativists. And we know there's a link between whether they're populists and nativists and what kind of parties they support. But there's not yet a link between those who fear automation and their political preferences. And you might ask yourself why that's the case. And I think the answer is something like the following. If I can just, sorry, I got lost here. The story basically is that there's not political entrepreneurs out there yet who are making that link and clearly talking to people. But the story is also that it's a fear that cuts across the political spectrum in large part. And you can imagine parties at the center and the center left having responses to this fear of automation that would be entirely acceptable to voters as much as those on the right. I'll just say something quickly now, and then we'll have a conversation, and that's that we could talk about it in detail, but I'm going to just literally push through 10 slides right now with Australian data, and you're going to see whether the story is different than Australia. There's populists and non-populists in their belief that jobs will be lost to automation over 10 years. A much greater belief among populists in Australia. A much greater belief among nativists in Australia that jobs will be lost to automation over 10 years. Here's fear of automation in Australia, 30% afraid or very afraid. But look at it among populists and non-populists. Non-populists, 20% are afraid or very afraid. Populists, 43%. Nativists, 22% of non-nativists in Australia are afraid or very afraid of automation. It's 45% among nativists. And it's the same story here as well. that nativists and populists want government to do something about automation and the fear of it, whether it's reducing immigration or it's investing in education, investing in retraining. And in the two-party vote, which is, I understand, an obsession in this country, Labour runs ahead among those who are populists and nativists by 8 points, and it runs ahead by those who fear automation by 11 points. That makes for very interesting politics. That's all I'll say for right now. Thanks very much. Yeah.
Hi, Peter. Thank you for that. One question that I want to start with is, to what extent what you're seeing, those connections between nativism and populism, or even the prevalence of a fear of let's wheel it back to that, fear of automation, is that connected in any way to someone's real material situation, educational attainment, their labour market history, their age, their gender? Sort of dialing this back to the question I started with, to what extent, just before we get to sort of running that upstream or downstream as you did, we'll get to that, but just sort of the bare facts of the matter, if you've had a chance with the data to sort of do a dive on it like that, is it the fact that fear of automation is confined to a certain segment of the labour market, as perhaps one of those graphs suggested it might be, or maybe not? Given that lots of jobs could be automated, and indeed it might be the expensive ones that could be automated. It might be exactly where you go first, and that would suggest that it's actually people with college degrees might want to be afraid of this, and not people with less educational attainment. I'm just wondering if you had a chance to have a crack at that.
Yeah. So the rational response is that if you look at it across economic class in some sense, right, or manual labor versus people who work in I don't know what it is we do, we push symbols or something around, right, that the fear should be basically evenly distributed.
Yeah.
Right. So just imagine it's essentially impossible to imagine a robot doing plumbing. It's very complicated, right? Houses are never square. It's actually an art to it. It's hard to do, right? It's not hard to imagine a robot assembling all parts of a car. Right now, when we do surveys, we think the plumbers and auto factory workers are the same people, right? They work with their hands, they typically have a college education at the highest level, at the most, so they must be the same. So rationally, those fears should be distributed differently across those different folks. If you look at the data, there's a relationship to age. Right. Older folks are more worried about most things, but they're worried about this. People who are in more manual occupations are more worried than those who aren't. That's a problem. Right? If you're working right now if you're a currency trader right now and you still work at a bank, you should be worried.
Yeah, right.
Because Goldman Sachs had something like 200 or 300 people on its currency desk in New York 10 years ago, and today it's got like 40 programmers and 3 people running the desk. Right? So, but the actual empirics in the data are that you get some distribution in terms of whether people are working in manual labor or not. They're a little more worried. Older folks a little bit more worried. But even the fear of it's not as structured as most things are. Right. In the data.
That's one thing I wanted to say, and indeed, I don't know if you had an opportunity yet, but one thing to perhaps milk out of the data at some point would be great to see if there's is this one of those things where the US is 5 to 10 years further down the runway than Australia, perhaps would be, from our interests here as a United States Study Centre in Australia, we'd love to know about that. Meet Claire. I know you guys met before, but Claire directs our Innovation and Entrepreneurship program, and we've done a few takes on this problem from different perspectives. We've looked at innovation in Australia, but sort of your bottom-up take is something I don't think we've done per se yet. No. But I'd like to let Claire pop a question into the conversation.
The thing that strikes me about this data compared to data that we've looked at is that this is how people feel about these things, whereas what I have looked at in particular is where things like where the jobs growth is in Australia and where jobs are declining, and looking at where there are job shortages or worker shortages, and that kind of in Australia tells a really interesting story, because the jobs in Australia where there is growth are caring professions, are convenience professions. So it's things like and the US data and the Australian data is pretty similar in relation to where the jobs growth is, because it's things like nursing, surgical assistants, and then things like waiters and chefs, as well as technical jobs. And so I was really interested to see this data because it's a completely different perspective. It's about how people feel as opposed to where the jobs growth is. And so the thing that really strikes me about this is to what extent. And you mentioned about the fact that there's not a lot of policy development happening in the US, but one of the things that we've been looking at is at a state level, there seems to be a much greater focus at a state level on workforce development policies in the US than there is than we're seeing here in Australia. And I just wondered whether you think that's a response to. And it's not partisan. It's both Republican and Democratic governors are, focusing on workforce development. I'm wondering if you think that is a response to a policy response to this, or whether you think that they haven't quite. Whether you think that something else is driving that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a lot of reasons why you've got a lot of money going to workforce training in the U.S., right? But I mean, a major reason is just massive long-term removal from the workforce, right? That the share of adults in the U.S. who don't show up in the unemployment numbers because they've stopped looking for work as a share of the population is staggering, right? And it really, the low unemployment numbers in the U.S. papered over the fact that there is massive just permanent exit from the workforce in whole parts of the country. Some of it is probably just purely the laboratory of the states where they're racing to do these things better than others, right? I mean, if you were a political entrepreneur today, if you were a politician really trying to make your mark, what you'd be doing in large part is thinking about the way automation is going to make some jobs actually better, right? So I'm the grandson of a long-distance trucker, and he would drive. Back in those days, you could drive forever, and you could drive 18, 19, 20 hours across Canada. You see nothing for 19 hours, and then you arrive in Vancouver, and you've got to drive a transport through a city where there's people everywhere, and that's a hard job. Right, keeping the thing straight on the Trans-Canada across the prairies, right, is not difficult. So if you're a policy entrepreneur, what you say is, we want to set up a regulatory framework where automated trucking occurs between cities. You're out on a straight highway, the trucks can go all day, right? But when it gets to a certain point at the city, that's when a human driver takes it over, because it's hard to drive a big truck through a city. And that driver who was away from his family or her family for days at a time is now doing 5 runs in and out of the city all day and is going home to their own bed at night, driving the same amount of time, making the same amount of money, but having a better life. Right. So there are ways where governments can think about regulation, especially in industries where which are very large scale, in a way that takes advantage of automation, makes people's lives better, makes it, creates incentives for companies to automate, or doesn't create disincentives, but is shrewd about it and is smart about it. Right. That's much better than trying to figure it out once people have been dislocated from their jobs. Right. And that, by the way, is just something that a party of the left can grab as easily as a party from the right.
One more from me. Let's try a very tight encapsulation of the findings as we go from fear of automation to nativism and populism to a vote choice. Is it the case that beyond nativism and populism, adding in, predicting how someone's going to vote, if I give you an additional piece of information, what someone feels about automation, that does not contribute anything. Right. But your sense is that will happen at some point.
Give it some time. Right. It's got to, and you can imagine how parties of the right will do it, right? So look at the way Trump deals with trade, right? I mean, he deals with it in there's multiple things going on at once, right? One is that he makes a big flurry about wanting to renegotiate NAFTA, and then nothing actually gets renegotiated. It's basically the same agreement with slightly more American content in cars coming out of Mexico. Literally, that's the whole thing, right? And it can sell a bit more milk in Canada. Bangs on about building a wall, but picks on a different company every month that's been offshoring jobs to Mexico and says, you're not going to offshore any more jobs. And Carrier says, okay, well, we won't offshore any more jobs, and we'll keep some jobs here in America. And everybody feels like they've won. Well, you know what the response is going to be with automation then, right? There's going to be some company in the U.S. that's going to decide to automate a ton of its workforce at once. It's going to create a big outcry, and a populist candidate, and they could do it from the right or the left, is going to say, I'm going to stop that company from doing this, right? Not having a real comprehensive policy response, but is going to try try to come down hard on a company.
Well, doesn't the company just say, well, we can have 20 jobs, people managing the machines, or we can have 0 jobs? How about that? How about that deal?
Yeah, you can try it. Yeah.
But we're seeing some of that already, right, with some of the targeting of particular companies about different things, like Amazon in particular has been really targeted, and yet there's huge jobs growth happening in logistics, similar to the way that you're talking about, but from a warehouse perspective. That's one of the big, in the US in particular, it's one of the big jobs growth areas is logistics, and it's probably less about automated trucks and much more about what's happening within fulfillment warehouses. Which is another really interesting angle on that.
So if we were to just step right back from the politics now, I took you there, now I'm going to put you away just before be the last question from me. That chart that we'd sort of borrowed from McKinsey, I suppose. What part of the labour market ought to be most worried right now? Australia's interesting, right? This job, occasionally I get to hang out with, we're very lucky, occasionally a law firm will host us for an event and whatnot. And Australian law firms are a long way down the runway on automation, particularly the ones that are big plugged in, big multinational concerns, where they've got the resources, they've got the bandwidth to invest in this technology, and the savings across their global businesses are huge, So they've done a lot of this. That was sort of, I think, in Australia where, wow, the demand for people with law degrees was all of a sudden, that's where it sort of reached right up into sort of middle class, upper middle class. What else, other than the massive processing of documents in law firms, what else is sort of there at the moment that your research has sort of uncovered as sort of perhaps another sector that's about to turn out not to be future-proof?
Yeah, well, I think accounting, finance, things that are related to the management of money, basically, are wide open for automation. So on the financial services side, I guess there's been there's a lot of disruption in the financial services sector in Australia right now because of the commission. But if you think about what investing was like before and what investing is like now, I mean, the ability to just go online and crack open you have ETFs here, crack open exchange traded fund, pay very, very low fees, and have no interaction with a human except for a little bit of an interview at the start of that process, and to completely cut them out of the process is just, it's incredible, right? So there's implications of that for financial planners, there's implications of that for people who are selling insurance, and there's tons of implications for that for the people who are on the floors trading or behind desks in banks trying to move money around and they're essentially being automated out, right? Think about accounting and auditing and all of these things where we're really talking about just massive amounts of data moving around, and the ability of computers to learn from those data much faster than we can is remarkable.
Peter, one of the other things that struck me from something that you said just before, which was about the people in the kind of exodus of the workforce in the US, because I noticed, I think it was in July for the first time, the number of open job openings in the US exceeded the number of unemployed. I think it was something like 6.7 million job openings and 6 million unemployed, which is kind of astonishing. And some of the data that we've been looking at is talking about the kind of the skills mismatch in terms of the types of workers that are being sought compared to the types of workers that are available is hugely different. Has the work that you have looked at, or this data that you've looked at, uncovered anything in relation to that and the kind of the fear of automation? I was interested in particular actually about the kind of the retraining and the focus on STEM in relation to the data that you've uncovered, because and I can't remember whether there was a big difference between the Australian focus on that and the US focus on that.
There's not a huge one. I mean, the rise of LinkedIn is a really interesting thing, and which reflects a larger trend in human resources, right? Which is that people can identify skill mismatches much more than they could before. Like the way LinkedIn's really working is you're going to put in the skills you want for a person, for a role, and it's going to do an automated matching of those skills to people who are available in the labor force, right? Where before, 20 years ago, the process of hiring a person was a much more human experience, where someone came in and you got a sense of whether you think they could do the role. Right, and that's probably as good of a sense as kind of the crude matching that's going on now. I mean, I think on the retraining side, where the future is over the next 10 or 15 or 20 years is universities at some point are going to get serious, or they're going to really die in the sector around doing really focused kind of micro training of people where you're going into a new role, there are some identified skills that you need. They can be learned in 2 or 3 days through focused intensive education. And universities are going to figure out how to provide that very quickly and credential it very quickly. And if they don't, someone else will.
It's already happening to some extent.
It is. I mean, it happens in places like this through executive education, but it's going to happen across a lot of sectors.
That's the primary delivery vehicle now, but you're right. But the micro class,
yes.
I don't need a degree. I don't even need a whole unit of study.
I don't even need to be in the same room as a professor.
But I need 12
By the way,
hours. Right. I need 12 hours on blah.
What's interesting about that is I actually have some LinkedIn data here, which because this is one of the things that I've been looking at. In the US, the 3 cities with the largest skills shortages overall are the San Francisco Bay Area, New York City, and Los Angeles. And in September, the number one skills shortage that was identified in those 3 cities was oral communication. But digital literacy and social media turned up across 2 of those locations, and research and graphic design and data science were the other ones that turned up across 2 of those. Leadership, interestingly, was the other one that turned up across all 3 in terms of skills shortages. So it's really like there's a lot of this data that's available now that is really interesting. But it struck me as still being able to speak well is a challenge.
Enormous.
Last observation from me on that. There's a lot of talk about STEM. I actually prefer STEAM. Put the A for arts back in there because you can be a triple threat. Good liberal arts background, but some technical nous. And the world's your oyster, as those stats.
Absolutely show that.
You know something about the world, you can speak well, and a little bit of technical ability. Punch your own ticket these days. There's my tip to your kids.
And I would agree
to my kids. Lots more we could talk about up here. The US unemployment stats are actually gangbusters. Labour market participation rates have stabilised, actually. It's very interesting. I'm really interested in who is getting back into the US labour market right now. And it's a really interesting thing about the Trump boom at the moment with unemployment at a 50-year low, and it doesn't look like it's plateaued yet. Like, where are these? So it's people coming off the sidelines who've been out for a while, and it's interesting, as one part of the economy is taking off in the US, some of your nativists and populists or fear of automation people are finding their way back into work. It might not be on the assembly line as they might have been 15 years ago. It might be wearing an apron or working at Home Depot or sort of casual retail sort of work. But it's a really remarkable thing that's happening in the American labour market right now.
If you want to talk about on the data side of it, if you look at the data, one of the big predictors of whether you're a populist is whether you think the economy is going badly. Right? I mean, it's just they're in economic distress. Now, you run the data and you ask people for their perspectives about where the economy is going to go and whether it's growing. Who's got really positive views of the economy in the U.S. right now? Populists.
Because the guy's president
in the White House and the economy's going gangbusters.
All right. I really did want to get people in, but I lied, didn't I? Can we have questions? And I already see a hand here. If you could just briefly introduce yourself. And a question, not too much of a speech. Thank you.
Hi,
Possible?
I'm Amanda, and I work as an analyst in one of the. And I work as an analyst in one of the finance companies. I was actually wondering, in terms of the breakdown of the data, whether there was more of a trend in gender, say, or age, and that sort of thing, in looking at who is more scared of automation and populism and nativism, because I recall that you said a lot of the older generation is scared of fear of automation, but that to me seems a little paradoxical, given that the younger generation is the one that's going to have to deal with it.
Yeah, I mean, there's no shortage of overconfidence among young people, right? About the way the world is going to. I used to be young at one point.
Well, I remember when you were young.
Yeah, you do.
When we were both young. Yeah.
The way the world's going to unfold. There's not big, stark gender differences.
This gentleman down here, thank you.
Thank you very much. Armin Hicks. I wanted to ask a question. Automation and robotics has been around for quite a while, actually. We've been through a blue-collar jobs, a whole lot of jobs were lost in the 80s and the 90s to blue collars. Arguably, populism and nativism didn't emerge in that period. Is it the fact that white-collar jobs are under threat that is actually driving this? Is that what the data says? And is the change that actually white-collar jobs are under threat? And is that critical in the political understanding of that?
That's fascinating.
Yeah, I think it's a very good observation. I would say two things building on it. I mean, one is that, you know, the story of populism is that it's a story of people who are able to exploit uncertainty and fear coming from multiple places, and to give it a logic or a narrative, you know, and it doesn't have to be rooted in the same things and in the same places. I mean, unquestionably, in the U.S., populism is rooted in a sense of racial grievance that particularly for white folks and white men who are in their middle age, this is the target market in some sense. They feel like their relative status has declined in the U.S. remarkably, and in large part that's actually true, right? I mean, they were very hard hit by the GFC in 2008. That's the group that's the only group in America that hasn't experienced an increase in life expectancy over the last 20 years, mostly because of alcoholism and drug abuse and some other things. So, you know, that's the cause in the U.S. It's a different cause, and it's a different cause in different places. But what we haven't seen yet is a massive, as you say, a massive dislocation of white-collar workers. There's a couple reasons for that, right? One is that the automation wave hasn't hit as hard as it's going to hit yet. But the other is that it turns out that people who get dislocated from so-called white-collar jobs are actually pretty good at finding a new job and finding something else that they can do, because their skills are actually kind of undefined and broad and are adaptable. It's hard for a person in a one-company town who's knocked out of a factory to then find work. There's just a lot more transaction costs for them, and it's a lot harder. The thing I would say, though, just the final thing building on your observation, is that if you were a policymaker in the 1980s, I mean, if you were running the government of Australia in the 1980s, that was a kind of an easy job, actually, right? Like, how are you going to make the country better?
I'm sure the people who were doing it would disagree.
Yeah. But Keating looks at it, and Hawke looks and says, "Well, we got to deregulate."
Malcolm Fraser and John Howard might have a different.
Yeah, but there was a lot of low-hanging fruit then, right? I mean, you could build out the super, you could deregulate the financial industry, you could float the dollar. There's all stuff that was hard to do politically.
That didn't happen till the mid-80s.
Yeah, hard stuff to do politically, but stuff you could do, right? Now, if you're a policymaker, what's the solution to automation? It's a big one, right? What's the solution to massive, population dislocation and migration? These are big. What's climate change? I mean, these are big problems that are harder than the policy problems that were there in the 80s, right?
That's two good points there. The last one, we see that all over the place. It's an observation you often hear about free trade agreements now. We've done the easy stuff.
Yeah.
Free trade, liberalisation after a wave of liberalisation, you're cutting into bone, as it were. But just going back to the first point, the 91, the recession in the US was as you asked your question, I was reminded of that. Unlike the oil shocks and the big wave of deindustrialisation in the United States through the 80s, it was, relatively speaking, a short, sharp recession in the early 90s. The Gulf War, the first Gulf War recession under Herbert Walker Bush, that led to Bill Clinton's "It's the Economy, Stupid" campaign. Why did that have such special resonance? Because where it landed, it was touching white-collar workers who were, and it had political resonance because it was affecting people who were close to the cut point anyway. They didn't need much of a shove to consider voting for the other side. And I think you've got to, when we think through the political implications of anything like this, sort of map, and that's what I like about this work, mapping it onto where is the economic shock landing, or the technological shock landing in terms of the political spectrum. If it's landing over here, it's going to take an awful lot to move to have people flip parties. But again, the 91 and what Trump did, these are people who were probably not rusted on Democrats and wouldn't need much of a shove to consider not voting for Hillary Clinton, and this being enough to get them over to vote for another candidate. But I just remember 91. It felt like this was a recession that reached up and bit the middle class, and in a way that you started to see layoffs of teachers and office workers. And this was no longer Detroit, because that had happened. Right? This was sort of reaching up into a different segment of the labour market. Sure. Let's get a microphone so we make sure it's captured for posterity.
Okay. Thanks very much. When you look back over the last 200 years, what we've seen is been increasing automation, people being put out of work, but at the same time new industries coming up, and those people put out of work getting jobs in the new industries. I can remember very well, one industry used to be putting shoes on horses. The other industry was collecting the horse manure in the streets of London. Both of those have now gone. Are we looking at a stage now with the automation that we're not seeing the new industries to absorb the new people? That's one observation. Another observation, just briefly, make it brief, is about populism and fear of automation. I personally have had experiences in the last week or so of an algorithm in banking, in a super fund, and in a health insurance fund, those algorithms in those three cases, meaning that I can't get what I want, I can't get an explanation of what's happened, I just get told it's an algorithm.
Yeah.
And I used to be able to talk to people, but I can't anymore.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, one of the so let's take, we could take these kind of in reverse order, but one of the big pushes right now in AI is what they call explainable AI, right? That if you're going to automate something, the people who are at the delivery end of that automation or that decision should be able to explain why it's happening.
Yeah.
Should be able to give a consumer an explanation of why it is you can or can't do something. It's a pretty reasonable standard, right, to imagine companies adopting. You know, and for doctors, I mean, the big challenge for physicians, for example, is going to be who they operate on first, right, or who they allocate something to, and it probably makes sense to automate those decisions, but they should know why they're being made. On the first point, I mean, it's kind of a cottage industry, right, that comes up every 25 years to predict that all the jobs are going to be lost, and it turns out people keep working, right? But it's still the case that mill towns and textile towns in North Carolina and South Carolina, which were eviscerated by the United States opening up the textile market to China in the early 90s, are still experiencing higher levels of unemployment and dislocation. It takes time, right? So you can look over a 200-year span and, yeah, people find work, right? But there are people who are out of work in places for years at a time. And that's where politics comes in. Right?
And I think I'll just hold this up, because this is a graph that shows the top 20 emerging jobs in the US, and I've marked all the ones that are tech jobs. So you can see, and this is why there's so much focus on STEM skills and technology, is because that, you know, these jobs, and, you know, they're data scientists, big data developers, full stack developers, that's where the emerging jobs are. But the extent to which you need numbers of those people is smaller than the extent to which you needed previous workforces. So the number of people that are being hired into those jobs is not necessarily the same numbers that you had previously. You need less of those types of people to do large volumes of work. Yeah.
Oh, sure. And then we'll come to this.
Chris Skinner. I'm interested in how you define automation. You seem to make it sound like it's driverless vehicles and it's robots and that's it. In fact, in the last 10 years or so, with smartphones, the internet and so on, automation is a global phenomenon, and people can now work remote from where the place of work is and so on and so forth. But really my question is, what about fear of criminal activity or lack of privacy, confidentiality and so on, more so than just a robot replacing your job? Isn't that really a big factor in people's opinions?
Yeah, no, it's very well put. I mean, it's one where you think about the cases where government's behind the curve in terms of responding to things, and thinking about governments are just essentially unsophisticated in the way they think about protecting the privacy of people, incredibly reactive, right? And then at once reactive and also not able to actually take advantage of the revolution in personalized data and what's going on.
Yeah.
I think it's a big part of fear of technology and tech companies. If people knew the degree to which they were monetized, to use a verb, but it probably really isn't a verb, by tech companies. If they understood the degree to which their data is worth something, and their behaviors are worth something when monitored and are being acted on, there would be a lot more outrage than there is. So I think that's another piece of it. Yeah.
The really interesting thing about that, and it's different, but just to draw a parallel, is that when the internet first kind of emerged, one of the big things that people were fearful about was about transacting online. They were very, there was this great fear that there was going to, that their financial records were going to be stolen, or that people would get access to their credit card details and things like that. And over the years, that fear declined quite significantly. And in large part, it was because the financial institutions put in place protections to make sure that if you did get caught up in a fraud type situation, that you would be protected from that. And that had a really big step change in the way in which people feared transacting online, to the point where now, most people feel very comfortable about buying things online. And I wonder the extent to which governments can address some of those kind of privacy issues, because it's a fear that strikes me that it's not identical to the issues around credit card fraud and credit card transactions, but there are similarities there in terms of it being about data that is about you that needs protecting. And I wonder the extent to which governments will be driven in the same way that financial institutions have had an imperative, right? They wanted people to buy more stuff from more people. Yeah. Governments, I'm not sure, have the same kind of imperatives.
And the pace is remarkably faster.
Yeah.
It's a breathtaking clip now.
Yeah.
Sometimes I wonder there's two possible futures. That is, or at least two, but the two I'm imagining are one where we get much smarter about protecting our own personal data. There's greater sophistication, and indeed there's some disintermediation happens between me and a Google or me and a Facebook, and that protects my privacy, and I'm more anonymous online. Or it goes completely the other way, right? And there's just much more mass surveillance and facial recognition, and it's possible for data companies to amass even more about me in close to real time. But if it's the former, then we're a very odd historical generation. We will be the generation of people for which, and historians will be very interested in us, because we've left so much about ourselves. Our digital footprint is so large, and I sometimes think we're the first humans to live through, or so it seems to us. Maybe that's a conceit too, but so it seems to us that we're creating this massive record about what it is we did and do and read and consumed and spoke to one another in email. It's sort of unparalleled, in at least so far in human history. But if we get the privacy clamp down, we could be could be the high watermark of that. We could be at this the first set of humans to have to deal with this.
Yeah.
But taking us way off topic there. Can we get a question from this young lady here? Thank you.
Hi, my name's Naomi. I'm from Meat and Livestock Australia. I was just wondering if you had any insight into, in industries where we struggle to fill the jobs, there still seems to be a bit of a fear of automation. I was just wondering if you could explain that a little bit, if you had any insights into that.
Yeah, well, I mean, what you've got, if you hear, well, you would know more, so why don't you go first?
So that's a really tricky question, because the kinds of jobs that are hard to fill are... So let me talk about a personal experience, because this I think is kind of interesting. When I look back at my career, what is really clear to me is that there are a whole lot of jobs that I have done, technical jobs, that no longer exist. So so I think it comes back to that rate of change. So I used to be an HTML coder. You don't do that anymore. I used to be responsible for a narrowband website, which is basically a dial-up website, right? They don't exist anymore. And so, when I look back at the jobs that I've done, there's 5 or 6 jobs that I've done in my career that they don't even exist anymore. And I think and they're technical jobs, which kind of is interesting when you think about the fact that that's where all the emerging jobs are. And so I think there's this huge rate of change, even in highly technical jobs, that mean that you need to be constantly reskilling and thinking about what's the next job that I'm going to do. Mobile is a perfect example, and Simon and I have talked about this before, where, even some of the massive businesses that have existed in the last 5 years no longer exist anymore because technology has wiped them out. But they were big businesses, and they were technical businesses. So I think it kind of comes back to that, the extent to which people are willing to deal with the change and reskill themselves, and not. And I think from an educational perspective, this is a really big challenge for universities, and we talked about it a little bit before, this idea of micro-credentialing, because it strikes me that we're going to need a workforce that is always thinking about what's my next job going to be, and what are the skills that I need for that job, and how do I attain those skills to take those next steps. So I think that may be a way in which policymakers can rethink education in particular. I mean, you might have a perspective on that as well.
The list of jobs that are hard to fill are technical jobs for the most part.
Some of them, most of them are, yeah.
And the point about them, I saw this firsthand in Silicon Valley, that what happens to the 45-year-old, 50-year-old coder?
Yeah.
They lose their job. 6 months later, they got another one.
Yeah.
Because I think what happened in Silicon Valley over time was an acceptance of this being the new normal. That the skills that I had 10 to 5 years ago were great for 10 to 5 years ago, but it's just part of being in the tech industry below a management level, means that whole paradigms about what work is in that business, where you do it. The idea that you're competing with people in Armenia, that the businesses have followed the sun software development models. People have got on board with that. Now, it's enormously stressful, and thankfully I'm a professor, and I do something else for a living. But I was very close to a lot of people, some of whom, 50 approaching 60 years of age, for whom, if they weren't recharging every 2 or 3 years, they knew they were just going to get mown down. And it had just been, and what were they being mown down? In some cases, it was automation of a generalized sense that was displacing, making a skill set redundant, or an investment in human capital had run its course. And I guess that's the point, that investments in human capital aren't for the life course necessarily anymore. Some of them serve a very discrete purpose for a discrete period of time. But what has to happen, Silicon Valley is a very unusual environment. It's got sort of enough people, enough critical mass, and enough places to go to get those skills. In some cases, the community is very much bottom up. But what a solution at scale for a society looks like. No one's really, I think, doing a particularly great job with that just yet. Many hands. Yes.
One of the other things to take into consideration, I was just in Reno, Nevada a couple of months ago. Now, Reno, the gambling industry is dead. They just don't go there anymore for gambling. And here's a whole city that's dead. And so I suppose the people in council are trying to say, how could we bring new industry or new growth to our city? So what happens is they bring in Amazon. Amazon's going to get 2 blocks, and the employment's going to be about 6. And it's going to be one whole warehouse, etc. Same thing in Europe with the smaller cities. Now that they can go to a shopping mall with Zara, which is a multinational, all the little shops are just boarded up, and the whole culture of the city is dying. People don't want to live there anymore. The shops are dead. There's nothing there. So automation is going to bigger scale, bigger multinationals. So what's going to happen to the populations in these cities that are dying. I mean, we saw that in the automotive industry when that closed up. Adelaide closed up with Holden. And so what happens when cities die? How do we keep them going?
Yeah, well, it's not something which I'm an expert, but there are two observations that people make about this, right? One is that scale really does matter, right? So your increasingly larger cities do better, right? But the second is that, you know, there's a lot of attraction in medium-sized cities. I mean, it's hard for small towns for sure. A place like Reno, which is I mean, why? I guess you go to Reno because you're in northern Nevada and you're not close to Vegas. But for a place like that, that's really a one industry, one horse town. It's pretty tough to respond, right? But if you look at Pittsburgh, which is always held up as the classic case, yeah. It's a town that survived because it was smart. Steel shut down in the 80s, yeah. Right? It impoverished the city for a little while, but it had great universities.
Yeah.
It's actually a physically nice place to be. The weather's tolerable. It's a beautiful city.
Weather's tough.
Well,
compared to
today.
Toronto.
Yeah. Compared to Toronto, it's nicer than Toronto. If you're not in Sydney, you're camping, right? It's a town that survived by being smart, right? And by bringing in technology companies and finding a way to rebuild its economy around human capital. Whether that model works now, where there's a massive dislocation because of automation, is an open question.
I think Pittsburgh is a very special case because of Carnegie Mellon and University of Pittsburgh being right there. And the other thing is the US, I think, has an ability with this issue it's such a big economy. There's a place to go and set up shop cheaply that sort of presents a bit of a cycle of renewal. So you can have a Pittsburgh story. Detroit's a harder case. But Reno, you know, Nevada is figuring out that one of the things that's got going for it is a ton of land, a ton of sunshine, and so who is setting up shop there? Data centers are going there, and what do data centers need? Lots of electricity, right? Logistics centers are going there because they're so close to either Northern California or Southern California markets. And the other thing is, it's over the border. You're not in California, and so the cost of doing business is a little cheaper. And that's an important point. That competitive federalism that is in the American model too also creates the ability for states to respond. Now, I'm not saying it's all sunshine and roses for the people of Reno with the collapse of, you know, gambling is essentially really centered on Las Vegas and the corporatization, the mega casinos and all the rest of it. But at the level of the nation, you know, that churn in the United States and you know and precisely almost because it is such a harsh labor market. Yeah, you know, the incentives for workers, but the incentives for people, investors as well, are both there. And so you tend to see, layer on some competitive federalism and more autonomy to state and local governments to do things. And you start to see, I think, you know, the ability to be resilient in the face of this incredible pace of technological change. You know. Could we... the gentleman in the back, and then there's a few more hands over here as well. We'll favour this side of the room for a little minute, and then I promise we'll come here. We've got about another 10 to 15 minutes. So if we can move expeditiously, everybody should be able to get a question. Sure. Who wants to?
Winston Mock, I was a McKinsey consultant a long time ago. As a politician, how would you manage two gaps? One is between perception and reality, the other between electoral sentiments and the long-term development or even survival of a country. So, first, as an example, if you look at job losses in the US the last 30 years, it is as much due to automation as to outsourcing. But most nativists attributed to outsourcing. And Trump has been able to exploit that very effectively to win the election. Now, going forward, in some democratic countries, there may well be a lot of pushback against automation. But if the US or Australia don't automate, Korea, Japan, Germany, and China will. Yeah. So, where do you end up? So how do you politicians manage or exploit those two gaps?
I mean, if you can come up with a simple set of solutions for how politicians can make long-term decisions for the long-term benefit, you'll fix politics, right? But it's not an easy thing. I mean, I think that the hardest problems in politics have two features. One is that they're unsolvable, but politicians can't admit that they're unsolvable. And the second is that the solutions that come to mind quickly are the wrong ones. So if you take drug use really quickly, right? It's very hard for a politician to stand up and say, actually, we're always going to have substance abuse in a society. There's just going to be some segment of people who are going to permanently damage themselves this way, and the intuitions you have about how to deal with that are wrong. Right? Punishment and criminalization doesn't work. Right? If you think about trade, I mean, this is the challenge with trade is that, you know, there's not a politician who can say, well, you know, this is going to be dislocation from trade and it's going to be hard to manage, right? And by the way, the solution is to have more trade so we get better at it. It's hard to say both of those things because you admit that you can't solve the problem, and you're telling people that their intuitions are wrong. Automation is a prime example of that, right? This is going to be uncontrollable at some level. It's going to be uncontrollable at some level, and people's solutions for how they think government should deal with it are going to be the wrong ones, right? That are going to lead to basically long-term national problems of competitive and comparative advantage, where countries that push back against it are not going to be the leaders in the future.
I'm so thankful for you for putting that particular insight on the table, you know, about automation versus outsourcing. You know, the real problem was automation. The political culprit was outsourcing. My board chair, Mark Bailey, tells the story of I believe, Mark, it's a Republican friend in the United States who, you know, basically makes a concession that this is not a problem we can solve for people of a certain status in the labour market, but it's a problem we might be able to solve for younger people, to equip them with this mindset, and for educational institutions to step up to the mark in what they're supplying for this constant replenishment of skill over the life course. And it's so disruptive, right? A BA or a master's degree, and that's your investment in human capital for life, for a high-paying, high-status career. That's probably not right. And where it's incredibly disruptive to those of us who thought that investment in human capital would future-proof us. But having... So I'm talking a lot. You get to talk a lot too, but I do want to make sure we get through the question.
No, I was just going to say that an interesting observation on that, because a few years ago there was a narrative that was coming from the Australian government in particular, which was about there will be job destruction and there will be job creation. But that's, I'm talking about 4-ish, 5 years ago. I don't think there would be the same line run now, and I think it's because those who are potentially affected by that is a much broader group. That you know, when it was a small kind of thing that didn't impact many people, it was okay to talk about that. Now there's this bigger fear, this greater potential. It's not discussed in.
Well, and they're more politically marginal.
And there's more political.
For the working class to lose,
yeah,
right? It's not going to result in changing votes.
Yeah.
For middle class people to start losing,
yeah.
now it might start.
Yeah, that's right.
And now politicians will take notice.
Yeah. Exactly.
Okay. Let's keep going. Yeah. Could we? Janine? Yes, thank you.
My name's Narelle Ryan. I'd love to hear your comment about the whole lack of transparency of the ethical standards that underline the development of algorithms, and particularly the notion, for example, your one about who determines, or at least the algorithm determining the priority for medical intervention. You know, who discriminates on the basis of age, for example? Or is it a matter of life and death immediately, whether you're 70 or whether you're 35? I mean, I think there's a lot of embedded or lack of there's a lack of transparency in those ethics, and I'd love to hear your comment on that and how we might overcome some of the discrimination that occurs both at a gender level and possibly at an age level.
And let me say three really quick things about it. One is that there's a lot of work being done at the center at Stanford this year on AI and the ethics around AI. So there's very interesting conversations going on. I've been lucky to be a part of. I've done some experiments actually in these data and some other ones where we give people a scenario where an algorithm is making a decision in a hospital as to whether a surgeon should stop operating on one person to operate on 5. And the experiment measures whether it's an algorithm making that decision or an administrator. And the basic story is that when an algorithm makes the wrong decision, when they switch and the original patient dies, as opposed to when an administrator makes it, people think the algorithm made a worse decision than the human making it. Right? They trust the algorithm less in the future, even though it's the same decision. Right? The benefit of algorithmic decision making, if we can explain it and we know what's going on, is we are intentionally programming in the ethical rules that we want to follow, as opposed to leaving it to a human in whatever state their mind is in that day to make a decision on behalf of other people. It's actually, in some respects, more desirable to have a cold, rational discussion about what you want done before you're in a position where a person has to make a decision in the heat of the moment. But the real challenge with this is that we actually have to make those decisions now as opposed to making them in the future. For people, the kind of popularized example is for people who are designing driverless cars, they've got to decide whether a car will swerve to avoid hitting one person at the risk of hitting 5, right? None of us get in our car and make that decision every time we start the car. We don't think about it, right? We just go ahead and drive our car, and at some point we might confront that awful decision, and we made it in the moment. Well, maybe we should think about it before we do it, but the point is that AI gives us a chance to actually program those things. But it's a major issue, and it's a political issue about how those decisions get made and why.
And I think just one other thing to add to that, which is that these kind of algorithms and the artificially intelligent machine learning that sits behind it is only as good as the data sets that they're trained on. And that's why it's so important that we have a diversity of people who are involved in both the decision frameworks around it, but also in developing those data sets, because the data sets need to be representative of the diversity of us to be accurately reflecting us. And that's one of the big challenges.
Here. Sorry, can I have a go? Thanks very much for a very, very interesting presentation. I just wanted to draw us, if I could, to something perhaps on the edge of the study, which is the relationship between politics and policy. I mean, I have heard, I think a number of us say the politicians don't seem to have much of an idea how to deal with these very complex matters, which is indeed why the populists are rising. And I just want to touch on the differences between the US and Australia. Just to make a rough analogy, it's extremely rough, but the workers in coal-fired power stations will have their sons and daughters possibly working in renewables in 20 or 50 years or whatever it might be. There's so many policy challenges in that shift. What I'm really wondering about is where the established political parties stand in all of this. If I understood some of your data right, but I may well have it wrong, the Australian left or the Labor supporters seem to be a bit more inclined towards seeing government as having some enhanced role, which is be exactly what one would expect, or what I would expect anyway. And I guess on the other side, though I don't think you go to this, perhaps more market-based scenarios would appeal to more conservative voters. So I'm just wondering, if the politicians are hopeless, I still would really like to know where the established political parties are. And there could be very significant differences between Democrats and non-Trump Republicans. Simon's mention of cooperative federalism is perhaps somewhat parallel to this, because, we're still in a contest of ideas between the major parties. I just really would like to see if they are still distinguished in their traditional way, or if, and we've got a bit of talk in this room that makes it sound like, there's going to be some overarching solutions. So I'd really just leave that as a question.
No, I think there's both. I think there are things which are very, if you're a party of the mainstream, whether you're on the right or the left, there are some pretty obvious things that you want to do, which are things like investing in STEM or investing in STEAM and having sensible micro credentials and retraining programs, et cetera, et cetera. I guess my my takeaway point is that the politics of the policy is wide open in terms of which parties are going to respond and how, right? And parties to the left have things that they can draw on, and that they can credibly draw on, and which is consistent and coherent with what they believe and they do to respond to this challenge, as do parties on the right and on the center right. So it's just a very difficult policy area, and it's one where people who are shameless about not knowing actually the facts of things and are happy to just exploit fear are going to be able to, they have a kind of a first mover advantage because they don't have to figure out what the actual solutions are, right?
And probably this is our last question. Thank you. Sure.
Thank you very much. I'm in analytics and studying RPA, robotic process automation. I would take this a bit outside of the just want to turn this from a bit more philosophical view, because I think that Western views are very into dark ages of philosophy. When we are talking about automation, I think we should look at the second line, populism, nativism. That's the fear we should focus on, because industrialism is actually what's already been done this automation. So we're already in that process long time ago. So we should focus. What automation is going to bring is to bring more to focus on cognitive. So I'm not for fourth industrial revolution. This is the first cognitive revolution. We are coming to an age where actually we can start to think more and leave the automated things for the machines. What we should fear more is privacy, because that gives more power to those that want to corrupt. Because the nature actually gives information, and if we utilize properly, then we can do better decisions. Like when you go to a doctor, you don't hide things, otherwise you'll never get proper solution. We should fear, as we said, populism, nativism, nationalism, and we should focus more on trust, because now we trust more machines than our actually philosophical thinking. Why are we doing things, not how? And we should actually focus on the power of collective wisdom rather than individualism. I would like some thought about that.
Well, so I'll just touch on one point, which is something that I've been thinking about, and other people who think with us a lot more are reflecting a lot on. But it has to do with human decision making and cognition. And the question essentially is this: is automation going to make our easy decisions for us? Right? So is it going to do the things that are easy to do, that we shouldn't spend too much time thinking about? Paying our bills, how to invest our money, how to get to work, right? What to eat in the morning, for example. Or should we let it automate the really big decisions? The big life decisions that take all sorts of reflection and things, so we can just focus on the small ones, right? Is it going to do the system one or the system two stuff for us? And that's still a wide open question, right? In a society where all the little things get taken care of and we're sitting around doing big thinking, is a much different one than where the machines are taking care of the big questions for us, and we just go about our days taking care of the hot cognition questions that we have to deal with.
That was a great place to take us to at the end. Because there's an optimistic path there as well, a world in which we are free to think about different things than we might occupy our days now, or at least the lucky ones, right? Those on the winning end of this historical trajectory. But what about those who aren't? Anyway, for another day, we could go on much longer. Thanks, everybody. Thank you all for coming out tonight. Thanks to Peter for a fascinating presentation that prompted a great discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Claire. Thank you all.